My revenge is spread over centuries, and it's just begun. Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Erschen, and this week we are reviewing another Hammer horror film. This is the Satanic Rites of Dracula, featuring the final performance of Christopher Lee as Count Dracula for Hammer Films. And also featuring the legendary Peter Cushing once again in the role of Lorimer Van Helsing. Now he did go on to play Van Helsing in one more film, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, but that did not feature Christopher Lee. So guys, the Satanic Rites of Dracula, very controversial entry in the Hammer Dracula series. It's pretty heavily maligned, a lot of people don't like it. And I honestly don't understand why, because I absolutely love it. I think there's some of the best scenes between Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing just chewing the scenery. I mean, I love it. Van Helsing, some classic Van Helsing and Dracula moments that I just chew up, I eat it up, I love it. So that's the reason to see this movie. You want to see some awesome Dracula, Van Helsing back and forth between Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. You get that in spades in this film, and it's some of the best stuff in the entire series. So I honestly don't understand the hate this movie gets, but I do acknowledge there are some flaws in the film. No question about that. I will be honest. The opening in the film kind of is very cheap looking. It almost feels like a 1970s old cop show like Columbo or the Rockford Files or Barnaby Jones or something, with the cheesy 70s music in the background. And there's like a really cheesy looking image of Dracula's like shadow going through the credits, and it looks like literally they took a cardboard cutout and did a shadow of it and just kind of moved it around the screen. It looks pretty cheap, and that's unfortunate because it kind of cheapens the film, and in an otherwise pretty well made, pretty solid edition of Dracula, but it does continue somewhat the events of the previous film, which was Dracula AD 1972, which was the first film to kind of bring Dracula into the modern age, at least at that time in 1972. And this film does continue that. We're still in the 70s. We're in the thick of the 70s. However, this film is a little bit different than Dracula AD 1972. That still had a little bit of the gothic feel and the gothic flavor of some of the earlier Hammer Dracula films, but this has no sign of that really. This is all about satanic cults and the Black Plague, and and there's a little bit of a spy thriller in there. There's even a car chase scene in this movie, like something out of like one of the old Steve McQueen movies, like Bullet or something. I'm like, what the hell? You would not expect that to be in a Dracula movie, like an intense car chase. But yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff. This is, I feel, one of the most fun entries, if not the most fun entry in the Hammer Dracula series. Yes, I'm acknowledging there is a bit of cheese in here, but there's also a lot of great stuff and a lot of great horror and some incredible scenes between Dracula and Van Helsing. And they are both at their absolute best in this film. They're at the top of their game, and I love it. So the film begins with we find out there's a secret agent who has been captured and is been tortured and beaten at this house called the Pelham House. It's like this country mansion, and the police, the Secret Service, have been investigating this house because there's a lot of strange goings on. And so they sent this guy as kind of undercover to investigate it, and he ended up getting caught and captured. So at the beginning of the film, he does plot his escape to escape the mansion. and he does just barely with his life, you know. They do kind of catch up with him and they chase them around, but he just barely gets away. But not before telling the police, you know, a little bit of what he found out about. And he found out that there are prominent members of society and government and ministries involved in this satanic cult that's going on at the Pelham house. As we did see a little bit of that in the beginning, we saw the cult going on, you know, we saw the altar, we saw the naked young virgin lying on the altar, looked like she's ready to be sacrificed, you know. And we see this, like, priestess ready to stab the dagger into her, you know, and saying all these rites, these passages, you know, to resurrect the Dark Lord, you know. And we don't know who the Dark Lord is that she's talking about. We'll eventually find out. He is somebody you might be very familiar with, especially in watching this series. So what happens is the man ends up dying. So we get Inspector Murray, who comes in from the previous film Dracula A.D. 1972, as played by Michael Coles, who does a great job reprising his role. Now, they don't mention really any specific details of the previous film Dracula A.D. 1972, but we know that he knows Van Helsing and he knows Jessica Van Helsing, his daughter. And of course, Michael Cole brings Van Helsing in as an expert because he's an expert on the occult. And obviously another thing, vampires. He's an expert on that. So they thought Van Helsing might be able to help. And Van Helsing looks into the case and he finds out that there are a lot of strains going on in that particular house, and there's also a big corporation that's kind of connected to it all. This big property development corporation that's headed by this leader by the name of D.D. Dedham. Take a wild guess at who D.D. Dedham is. But at any rate, we see Van Helsing doing some investigation along with his daughter, who this time is played by Joanna Lumley as opposed to Stephanie Beacham in the last film. So yeah, they changed the actresses in the film, but I think she does a fine job. It's really not that noticeable. I mean, she does a fine job, you know. She's a solid replacement for Stephanie Beacham. Also very attractive, you know, classic Hammer vixen, you know. I think she does a fine job. Maybe even better than Stephanie Beacham. But at any rate, also Michael Coles, who plays Inspector Murray, he does meet up with Jessica, and they decide to do some more investigating inside the Pelham house. And they end up running into these vampires, you know. They search into the this lair, this dungeon, because Michael Cole hears Jessica screaming, and Jessica gets attacked. She gets mauled by a whole group of Dracula's brides. And they're all kind of like chained up, but they're all like surrounding her, you know, trying to claw at her, trying to bite her, you know. And it's a really cool scene. It's actually pretty scary, you know. Very enjoyable. So again, Professor Lorimer Van Helsing does some investigating on his own in the meantime, and he meets up with this scientist who is one of his old colleagues, and it turns out he's actually involved in this cult as well, and he's actually developing this kind of cancer caused by asbestos. He plans to bring about the Black Plague, you know. So like, and Lorimer is freaking out. How could you do this? What are you doing? And then he goes to further investigate this D.D. Dedham, who's the leader of the corporation, the Property Development Corporation. And it's so funny, this scene, when he walks in, the concierge is like, oh, no one gets in to see Mr. Dedham, not ever. And Van Helsing's like, well, why don't you just tell him my name? And bring, and the phone rings, and he's like, okay, I'll send him right up. So he's like, I can't believe it, but he says go right up. Obviously, the man knows who he is, you know. He's very acquainted with Lormar Van Helsing. Why? Because he's Count Dracula, the Lord of the Undead, as played so brilliantly by the legendary Christopher Lee in his swan song portrayal of the character for Hammer Films. And I just think he does an awesome job. And there's some of the best scenes when Lormar Van Helsing goes up to the big office to meet with Mr. D.D. Dedham, and he's kind of in the shadows while he's sitting on his desk. There's no light, you can barely make out his face. And he kind of puts on a fake accent, and it's so funny. But it's great, it's awesome. And he's like, stop meddling, Mr. Van Helsing. And he's like, you're really Count Dracula, aren't you? And so he busts out the cross in the middle of the office, and he's got this gun loaded with a silver bullet. That's right. Apparently, Dracula can be killed by a silver bullet. They created that rule for this movie. They also created another major rule, conveniently, for this movie. There's so many rules that Hammer made up to kill vampires. You get the clear running water. You got the garlic. You got the crucifix. And in this film, they create the hawthorn bush or tree, symbolizing Christ's crown of thorns. That can kill him as well, apparently, and so can a silver bullet. I was like, isn't that werewolves? I thought werewolves only get killed by silver bullets, not vampires. I think they kind of confused their mythology there. But at any rate, it's awesome. So Peter Cushing gets ready to shoot Dracula with silver bullet. And Dracula's like, foolish man, bullets can't harm me. I love it. But he's like, but silver bullets can, Count Dracula. I love it. And so just as Van Helsing is about to shoot Dracula, he gets mauled by Dracula's servants, you know. So they capture Van Helsing, and they take him to the Pelham house, the country house where all the big cult is going on. And, you know, Van Helsing finds out that Dracula's plan is to bring about the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, to basically destroy the earth. Because he actually wants to die himself. He wants to be rid of the curse of being a vampire, which I found very interesting. He wants to basically commit suicide, but at the same time take out as many people as possible. Take out the entire world, pretty much. That's his plan. And at his bidding are these major heads of corporation and heads of government. So it's a big deal. So he can get some stuff done here. And, you know, the scientists developed that plague, and he's ready to unleash it on the world. And another thing is he's kidnapped Jessica Van Helsing, so we see Jessica laying on the altar of sacrifice. Cue Slayer song, baby. Cue Slayer song. But at any rate, so we see Jessica lying on the altar of sacrifice, and Dracula's prepared to give up the ultimate virgin sacrifice to bring about the plague of the Black Death. And it's also on an important date, which is the Sabbath of the Undead. Such great stuff, I love it. But of course Dracula's plans get foiled, you know. Someone ends up knocking over the candles, and then one of the guy actually, he cracks the bottle of featuring the plague, and it goes coursing through his body, and he burns up, and he's melting, you know. It's really nasty. But yeah, the place goes up in flames, and you see Dracula getting ready to take out Van Helsing to get his ultimate revenge, and that's when he says that classic line, I did right at the beginning of this video, which is one of my favorite lines in the entire franchise. It's so awesome. You see the fire in the background, and you see Dracula at his best, you know. I just love it. But of course, Van Helsing gets away, and Dracula chases him to, guess what? Into the woods, where there are thorn bushes. So it's so awesome. It's funny. It's a little bit cheesy. I'm going to be honest. Yes, this was kind of one of the cheesiest deaths of Dracula in the franchise. So spoiler alert, I am going to discuss it if you guys have not seen the film. But it's one of the... I really enjoy it, even though I know that it's cheesy. It's so funny when you see Van Helsing say, "Count Dracula!" He's yelling through the woods, and Dracula's like struggling with the thorn bushes, and he's trying to get at Van Helsing. And it's awesome too. You see him with the fangs, and he's like trying to get at him, but he's trapped in the crown of thorns, symbolizing Jesus Christ, and he can't get out. You know, he's tied up in him. He's like, "Whoa!" You know, so awesome. Just great stuff. And while Dracula's trapped and he cannot escape, that's when Van Helsing grabs the wind stake through the heart. Bam! And then we see Dracula die, and we see him turn into dust, and we see the fog and the mist go everywhere, and it's just classic. I love it. And there you have it, guys. The Satanic Rites of Dracula. One of my favorite in the franchise, even I know it's heavily maligned. Yeah, I know it's got some cheesy 70s music, a little bit of cheesy 70s acting from some of these people in smaller roles, and some of the dress is really cheesy too, the way people are dressed in the film. That classic 70s style, but it looks pretty cheesy. And yeah, you can tell that this film definitely has a smaller budget than some of the previous entries, where we saw some nice budget. You know, they had the Gothic castles with the candlesticks everywhere, and there's really none of that in this film, and that is kind of missing in this film. You do miss that Gothic classic feel. But at the same time, when you have Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing together, it's just absolute gold. And here they do some of their best stuff, and for me that's the reason to watch this film, and that's the reason I love it. So guys, check out Satanic Rites of Dracula. Don't listen to what other people tell you, because this movie is so freaking fun. I love it. It's also known as Count Dracula and His Vampire Brides, and that's kind of a hacked up version that was released in America. So definitely get Satanic Rites of Dracula. And thank you for joining me, Sean Patrick Erschen, in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared.